Hello, everybody. We are continuing on now after having gone through the 9 parables that Jesus had given, which explained the new facet of the kingdom of heaven, which was beginning. Mark stated that on that day, when evening was come, Mark 4:35, this was the same day that the rejection had occurred, but night finally arrived. On this day, he was officially rejected on this day. He pronounced the judgment for the unpardonable sin on that specific generation. And on this day, that same day, he had introduced the new facet of the kingdom program. As evening came on this fateful day for Israel, he ordered the apostles to get into the boat to cross over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. His decision resulted from seeing, quote, great multitudes all around him. So Jesus' purpose was to leave the multitudes. Luke, who emphasizes the humanity of the Messiah, stated, quote, but as they sailed, he fell asleep. Jesus was tired and fell asleep. That's Luke 8:23. And he was in the boat and fell asleep in the boat. But when suddenly a severe storm hit, which Mark described with these words, quote, and there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the boat. That's Mark 4:37. Matthew stated, quote, and behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea. Matthew 8:24. And Luke observed, quote, and there came down a storm of wind on the lake. That's Luke 8:23. The Sea of Galilee is surrounded on the east and west sides by mountains, hills, and sheer cliffs. And on the west side are the hills of Lower Galilee. And on the east side are the Golan Heights, also known as ancient Bashan, Bashan, Bashan. To this day, periodically, the winds can come rushing down both sides of these mountains, causing a tempest to suddenly be stirred up. Just as suddenly the winds stop and the sea slowly calms down. In the situation described in this passage, the winds hit while Jesus and the apostles were crossing the sea. A fitting conclusion to what had already been a stormy day of a different kind. All 3 Gospels emphasize the extremity, the seriousness of the situation. Mark stated, quote, insomuch that the boat was now filling, Mark 4:37. Matthew added, insomuch that the boat was covered with the waves. That's Matthew 8:24. The wind was blowing so hard that the waves were breaking over the top of their boat and flooding it. Luke concluded this. They were filling with water and were in jeopardy. Luke 8:23, meaning there was a real danger of loss of life. These experienced fishermen had been in rough seas before, but this was obviously a very unusual wind. In the midst of this desperate situation, Jesus' sleep was undisturbed. Matthew stated, quote, but he was asleep. And Mark was a bit more detailed. He stated, quote, and he himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. That was Matthew 8:24, Mark 4:38. Finally, the apostles had to awaken him and cried for help. Save, Lord, we perish. And, quote, Master, Master, we perish. That is Matthew 8:25 and Luke 8:24. Mark noted that the cry for help was emotionally accusatory. They were accusing Jesus. Teacher, don't you care that we are going to perish? That's Mark 4:38. The divine purpose of this first lesson, since Israel's national rejection, was to teach the disciples' dependence on the Messiah in every situation. And in response to their cry for help, Jesus verbally addressed the wind and the sea. First, quote, he awoke and rebuked the wind. That's Mark 4:39. The Greek word for rebuke means, quote, to muzzle. It was as if the prince of the power of the air had sent the wind and Jesus muzzled it. Well, Locke's, a commentary specializing in rabbinic things in general, says this: Jesus, quote, rebuked the winds and the lake as though they were conscious beings possessed with demons. And that the winds as well as the sea were said to be represented by, quote, a prince, angel, or demon of the sea. Mark 4:39 has an additional phrase, peace, be still. The Greek, translated to be muzzled, is a term used in exorcism, meaning to silence or to make the demon ineffective, as in Mark chapter 1, verse 25 and Luke 4:35. Second, Jesus said unto the sea, peace, be still. Okay, two things immediately happened. Quote, and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. That's Mark 4:39. Not merely a natural calm, but a great calm. Not a slow calm, but a sudden one. The raging suddenly and totally ceased. Then came the lesson to be learned. The disciples had already been rebuked for their lack of faith before the miracle. They were further rebuked by the questions Jesus is now going to ask them. Why are you fearful? Have you not yet faith? Mark 4:40. Don't you have faith yet? In other words, the Greek word for fearful describes a cowardly fear. Well, I don't know. I would have been pretty cowardly myself. Well, that's what Jesus was saying. They showed cowardly fear during the storm. Mark added, quote, and they feared exceedingly in Mark 4:41. The Greek verb here is phobeo, the root of which means fear in the sense of awe and reverence. The disciples here were awestruck. Matthew described the content of the reverence. Quote, what? They asked this, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Matthew 8:27. Luke's description is, quote, who is this that he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him? That's Luke 8:25. The miracle they had just observed was a visible repudiation of the Pharisees' explanation of his person, because they said he was demon-possessed. Well, the lesson they are to learn is that he is more than a man. He is the messianic God-man. He was never in subjection to the prince of the power of the air. Rather, he was able to muzzle him and muzzle his winds. Eldersheim makes a comment about the creation. Romans 8:20 says that the creation has indeed been made subject to vanity. And what that means is that this evil, which implies not only decay, that the creation is subject to decay, but it is subject to rebellion. That is directly due to the fall of man and will be removed, thankfully, at the final manifestation of the sons of God. And Paul stands on the same ground as Jewish theology would say, which teaches that although all things were created in their perfectness, yet when the first Adam sinned, they were corrupted. Next is another miracle occurs, and it is found, after they got across the Sea of Galilee, and they going to encounter the worst case of demonization there has ever been recorded. Sorry, let me get my scriptures here for you. This is found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 to 34, and Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, and Luke 8, verses 26 to 39. So when they came to the other side of the sea, they crossed into the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had come out of the boat, Jesus and his disciples right away, in other words, there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling in the tombs, and no man could any more bind him, no, not with a chain, because that he had been often bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been broken apart by him. And the fetters, I think that means restraints, right? Whether they're ankle or wrist, broken in pieces, and no man had strength to tame him. And always, night and day, in the tombs and in the mountains, he was crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and worshipped him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, you Son of the Most High God? I plead with you, I adjure you, by God, torment me not." For he said unto him, "Come forth, you unclean spirit, out of the man." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he besought him much, he pleaded with the Lord much, that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was there on the mountainside a great herd of swine feeding. And they pleaded with him, saying, "Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them." And he gave them leave. And the unclean spirits came out and entered into the swine. And the herd rushed down the steep into the sea. And in number they were about 2,000. And they were drowned in the sea. And they that fed the swine, the pigs, and told it in the city. So they went and reported everywhere in the city and in the country. And people came out to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and behold him, and looked at him that used to be possessed with the demons, sitting, clothed, and in his right mind, even him that had the legion, and they were afraid. And they that saw it declared unto them, okay, hold on a minute. And they began to beseech him to depart from the borders. And as Jesus was about to depart back to the other side, he that had been possessed with the demons came to Jesus and besought him, asked him that he might be with him. And Jesus would not allow him, but said unto him, "Go to your house, to your friends, and tell them how great things the Lord has done for you, and how he had mercy on you." And he went his way and began to publish in Decapolis, which is a conglomeration of 10 cities called the Decapolis, how great things Jesus had done for him. And all men marveled. Now a little bit of an explanation here. For the first time, the Gospels provide a very detailed description of a demonized person. And Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 4 in particular, sheds light on what it is like to be possessed. It is noteworthy that the event took place right after Jesus, the Messiah himself, was accused of being demonized. And it disproves the allegation and confirms the truth of Jesus' statement. He was stronger than and not subservient to Satan. He now faced a man in the most extreme degree of a demonized state described in Scripture. The possessed man dwelled in the tombs and showed superhuman strength. He wailed constantly and was self-destructive. That is in Mark chapter 5, verses 3 to 5. And he was excessively aggressive. Matthew 8:28. And he approached Jesus stark naked. That's in Luke 8:27. Mark stated that they crossed over to the other side of the sea. Well, now they are on the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. And the Jewish mindset about this is that they understood that the, quote, other side was contrasted with, this is our side, the other side, our side, the Jewish kosher, religiously correct side versus, quote, the other side, okay? And just another thing that rabbinic Judaism thinks of, how they think about Gentiles. Well, be prepared. It says, with respect to the impurity of Gentiles, The Mishnah relates, quote, the school of Hillel say this, he that separates himself from the uncircumcision, that means us Gentiles, is as one that separates himself from the grave. Well, furthermore, in the book of Acts, Luke writes, with respect to Peter's response, Peter had visited the Cornelius' household, and when he got back from that visit, certain brethren also complained that Peter should not have been eating with Gentiles, because they were never allowed to sit down at any portion of a meal with a Gentile. Quote, you yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. That's Acts chapter 10, verse 28. Well, here is Jesus coming to the rescue of one of these Gentiles. Well, both Mark and Luke noted that this event occurred in the country of the Gerasenes. Gadara was both a city and a region. Okay, and there's a little bit of a clarification. Some people critics might believe, have claimed that this is an obvious contradiction. Well, in Mark and Luke, noted that the event occurred in the country of the Gerasenes. Matthew, on the other hand, stated that it was the country of the Gadarenes. That's Matthew 8:28. Well, how they explain this, in other words, that there is no contradiction. Okay, just leave it at that. There is no contradiction. So the Sea of Galilee had both a Gentile side and a Jewish side. The Jewish side was from Migdol to Bethsaida, and the Gentile side was from Tiberias to Gerasa. Okay. And that was the Gentile territory, was part of that Decapolis. Well, in a commonly accepted manner of reporting at that time, Mark and Luke mention only one demoniac, emphasizing the more prominent individual, whereas Matthew noted two, providing the larger context. So there is no contradiction here between the different authors of the Gospels. It was a type of reporting that will appear even later in the Gospels. So you can emphasize the more prominent of the two, and that's okay. It may also indicate that while both men were demonized, only one of them had to deal with a whole legion of demons. Matthew stated that the demons recognized two things. First, they understood who Jesus was. Quote, what have we to do with you, you Son of God? Wow. Matthew 8:29. Their recognition of Jesus included worship. Mark 5:7. For demons perceive the deity of the Son. Second, they acknowledged their ultimate doom. They knew they were destined for the lake of fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels. They said this, are you come hither to torment us before the time? Matthew 8:29. In this incident, Jesus used the standard Jewish approach to exorcism and asked, "What is your name?" Mark 5:9. Well, a Roman legion consisted of 6,000 soldiers, but this may not be the actual amount, because there may not be thinking in a Roman context, but what the Jewish people considered legion. Well, not to get into that, to let that persuade us either way. Well, all this does demonstrate is that clearly how much stronger Jesus is than Satan and his kingdom. Okay, the demons knew very well that they were about to be cast out, but they made a request, and they entreated him, quote, that he would not command them to depart into the abyss. That's Luke 8:31. Now, Dr. Fruchtenbaum's going to explain about this, which is very helpful. The abyss is a segment of a larger place in the center of the earth called Sheol in Hebrew and Hades in Greek. Throughout the history of the Hebrew Bible, both the righteous and the unrighteous went down to Sheol when they passed. There were two compartments. The good side was called paradise and Abraham's bosom. But the latter name, Abraham's bosom, is the one most frequently found in rabbinic writings, but it only occurs in the scriptures in Luke 16, verse 22. During Old Testament times, when believers died, their bodies were buried in the ground, and their souls went to paradise or Abraham's bosom. They could not directly enter God's presence because the atonement available to them was just animal blood. That could cover their sin, but not remove the sins. Okay. So the Old Testament saints, and this is spoken about Hebrew 10, verses 1-4. A person's salvation was based on grace through faith. And while animal blood provided forgiveness, it did not remove sin. It covered it, in other words. Therefore, until the Messiah died, a saint could not go directly into God's presence in heaven upon death. His soul went to paradise. The second division of Sheol is reserved for the fallen angels and the souls of the unrighteous. As Luke shows in the story of Lazarus and the rich man, the dead on both sides of Sheol could see each other and talk to each other, but they could not cross over. Abraham explained to the rich man, because, quote, there is a great gulf fixed, and they that would pass from here to you may not be able, and that none can cross over from there to us. Luke 16:26. The bad side of Sheol has 3 subdivisions. One subdivision is hell, which is for unbelieving humans. Their bodies are also buried in the ground, but their souls go into hell. The second subdivision is called Tartarus. This is a permanent place of confinement for fallen angels, specifically for those who, in Genesis 6, there was a rebellion. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful and made wives of whomever they chose. So in Genesis 6, they had married human women. Fallen angels married human women. And what was the result of that union? Well, the giants and those like Goliath and other prominent figures. They were men of renown, it said. They had superhuman strength, like angels do. They had other intelligence, highly intelligent, more intelligence. So therefore they constructed very amazing pyramids, etc., things like that. Well, so Tartarus is a place, a permanent place of confinement for fallen angels, specifically for those who in Genesis 6 had married women. The third subdivision is the abyss, which is a temporary place of confinement for fallen angels in general. Some are there now, and they will be released later in Revelation chapter 9. Satan will spend the millennium, the 1,000 years, in the abyss. But then he will be released in Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3, for a very short time. So both the abyss and Tartarus are areas of confinement for demons. However, the abyss is temporary and Tartarus is permanent. By way of analogy, it is the difference between jail time and life in prison. The demons in this passage above asked not to be sent to the abyss. When the Messiah died, Jesus died, he experienced what all other human beings experienced at that time. At the time, his body stayed in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, but his soul went into Sheol. However, it's important to note that Jesus never spent even a moment in hell. His soul went to paradise. His death itself accomplished all that was necessary for the atonement. He not only died for sins committed after his death, but also for all sins committed prior to Jesus' death. That's Romans 3:25, Hebrews 9:15. Only now were the sins of the Old Testament saints removed. While Jesus was in Sheol, he proclaimed to those who were there in paradise that the atonement had been made, and to those on the other side, his presence guaranteed their final judgment. When Jesus ascended into heaven, paradise was emptied and the souls of the captives were taken directly to heaven. That's Ephesians chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. Today, when believers die, their bodies still stay in the ground, but their souls go immediately into God's presence in heaven. The references for that are Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 to 24, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, especially verse 8. Quote, it says this, "To be absent from the body is to be present at home with the Lord." However, things have not changed for unbelievers. To this day, when they die, their bodies are placed into the ground and their souls go to hell. It will stay this way until the end of the Messianic kingdom. Then God will do away with this earth, and all unbelievers will be taken out of hell to stand before the great white throne to be judged, and then to be cast into the lake of fire. And this will be their final eternal abode. Well, as previously mentioned, the demons in this passage specifically requested that Jesus not send them to the abyss, Luke 8:31, but rather that they might be allowed to enter a herd of swine that was feeding nearby. And for unexplained reasons, Jesus granted their request. The explanation frequently given is that under the law of Moses, eating pigs was forbidden. However, this was Gentile territory, not Jewish territory. So the Jewish law did not apply in this case. Thus, the reason he allowed it is not known, but Mark specified that the swine numbered about 2,000, and that is Mark 5:13. We're almost done here. We'll finish this. Demons entered the herd. The pigs rushed into the Sea of Galilee and drowned themselves. Those in charge of feeding the swine fled from the scene and informed both the city and the country what had happened to the pigs and to the demoniacs. Mark 5:14. The result was that, quote, all the city came out to see what had occurred and who was responsible. That's Matthew 8:34. They saw the demoniac now sitting at Jesus' feet instead of threatening those who passed by, clothed instead of naked, and in his right mind, rather than wailing uncontrollably. Mark 5:15. One of the two men, quote, that had been possessed with demons, asked Jesus that he might go with him. That's Mark 5:18. He wanted to become a disciple of Jesus. However, he was a Gentile, and at that point in Jesus' ministry, he was not accepting Gentile disciples. Instead, he instructed him, quote, go to your house unto your friends and tell them how great things the Lord has done for you and how he had mercy on you. Mark 5:19. Jesus did not apply that prohibition against telling others who he was to Gentiles. Rather, he encouraged the man to proclaim the message, which according to Mark chapter 5, verse 20, he did among the cities of the Decapolis. Well, the former demoniac had a rather extensive ministry, and, quote, all men marveled, Mark 5:20. The result of his work will be seen later. The demoniac's evangelization will be seen because later Jesus returns to the same area. He's going to feed 4,000. And whereas before the people asked Jesus to leave at this point in time, later they're going to ask Jesus to come in and be welcome. And that is in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to Mark 8, verses 10. We're going to stop right here. Thank you so much. God bless you.